I want to talk about having the right fit people listening to your show because this is often the problem. It is absolutely understandable that you want to grow your podcast. I do too. We all do. Like most things, bigger's better, right? But, but, here's the deal. When we start growing for the sake of growth, we run into a new problem, which is that we've seen growth, we've got listeners, but we don't have buyers. We don't have clients. And this can sort of show up, it can manifest in a couple of different ways. And we're going to talk about that today. But I want to get clear on this because it is an absolute epidemic happening when we have business owners who are using their podcast to generate, educate, and convert right fit clients, almost exclusively seeming to take advice from shows where the podcast is the business model, where I'm looking to sell sponsorship spots. And so it doesn't matter that no one is doing anything with the show because I just need the ears there so that I can tell them about this new offer from XYZ sponsor. And this is causing you a ton of frustration because it means you're not receiving input that is a match for your output. Because what you're looking for is a sales tool. What you're looking for is a leveraged sales mechanism. But if you're following advice from folks that are looking to build listenerships so that they can sell them sponsor spots, you're often moving in a direction that is the opposite of the way you need to go to reach your sales goals. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. This is a big one because I've been sitting down with folks for podcast strategy intensives. We've even seen this over the last probably 12 to 18 months when we onboard our production clients, where they're coming from a situation where their previous partner, production or strategy, where the things that they were taught, the sort of tent poles that they've built their show with, are actually better fitted for a show where the audience is the offer, meaning you're monetizing via sponsorship. And so it is about getting as many ears on the podcast as possible. It is about download numbers. It is not about getting those folks to do anything specific, because I'm getting paid based on how many people download, not how many people convert. Now, if you're running a show like this one where you're really looking to use the show to generate, educate, and convert right fit clients into our business, where your podcast is a sales tool, a function, and a piece of your sales team, then it actually doesn't matter if you have 10,000 people listening if you can't get any of them on a sales call, if you're not having conversations with any of them. And so when we do this, where we work at growing the show because we think, okay, well, I've got to have an audience. There's got to be somebody there, right? There's nobody to educate and convert if we are not generating listens. And you focus so much on that listener generation that it is anybody's cool. As long as you're listening, you're part of the team, you end up with sort of a different kind of frustration, which is that you have this massive output energetically, intellectually, time-wise, capacity-wise. If you have support for your show, if you're working with a production partner, a financial output. So if you have all of that so that you can be generating sales and your show is not generating sales, it's really easy to point to the podcast and say podcasts don't work. A podcast can't work for me. Podcasts can't act as a sales tool. But it's because you largely are building a show that's purpose is to generate downloads, not sales. And that's a huge difference. And it's a distinction I want us to talk through today because I want us to look at a couple of pieces. I want us to look at the sort of the differences between listeners and potential clients, and some of the red flags you might see around your podcast attracting maybe not the right listener, but also maybe not the right client. Maybe you are getting those sales calls trickling in, but you get on them and you're like, how did you get here? Right? And then, most importantly, I want us to wrap up with something really actually helpful, something that will sort of a shift you can make now. And that's in how we can shift your podcast to make sure you are attracting those right fit clients. Because ultimately, that's the goal. I want us to move through this episode sort of reflectively. I want us to be looking at your show and thinking about your show as we move through this conversation, because I'm almost positive, and that's because I'm humble, that you're going to see, if not your show right now, some version, some time in your history with your show where this was an issue. And even if right now it feels like it's working okay, this is the world of 1%, right? This is where we start making those 1% changes to see improvement. And I absolutely guarantee there's going to be something today where you're like, ooh, we could clean that up, or ooh, I want to try that. So be paying attention to that, make note of that, and then implement. Go and do the thing, because that's where the difference is. And by the way, if you are struggling to implement this or something here feels unclear, ask that question. Head over to uncommonlymore.com/AMA. That's where I collect questions that I answer over on the private podcast, the podcast newsroom. I've got a whole big batch coming up of me getting in to do those for the summer. So make sure you are leaving those questions. Uncommonlymore.com/AMA. Let's get this answered. Let's get this clear so that you can move forward with this, so that you can make these, again, 1% changes. Nothing about this is about you burning down your show. Nothing about this is about you scrapping your show and starting over. It's about, where do we make the refinements, the evolutions to improve your show? That's what I want us to be looking at. And those are the kinds of questions I'd love to be answering for you over on that podcast newsroom. So again, one last time, submit your questions at uncommonlymore.com/AMA. And oh, just in case you haven't subscribed to the podcast newsroom yet, which is another great way to get a better idea of what you'd like to ask, is listen to the questions that have been asked and answered so far. But you can subscribe over at thepodcastnewsroom.com. Let's start by looking at the difference between listeners and potential clients. Like, how do we get here? Because a podcast can get listeners, but that doesn't necessarily mean those listeners will be good quality leads. A podcast could get leads, and it doesn't mean that they're good quality leads. And ideally, we're not just generating leads. We are generating good quality leads. Leads where we show up to the sales call and they show up to the sales call too. Because I don't know about you, but I hate a no-show sales call. Like, it's really frustrating when you prep for the call and you show up for the call and you're just like, okay, I'm here alone. That's not fun. And so I have found that never, and I don't love to speak in absolutes, but I don't ever have someone no show who came via this podcast. Do you want to know who no shows me for sales calls? The only group that still no shows me for sales calls: referrals. Folks that came in via referral is the only instance I've had in the last 3 to 5 years probably where I got no-showed on sales calls. It has consistently been somebody who came in via a referral. Not a single instance has it been somebody who was nurtured through the podcast, who found the show either via social or even was referred to the show and listened to the podcast. But nobody who's come through the podcast or has listened to the podcast as part of like getting ready for that sales call has no-showed me for a sales call. Not one. And I have thoughts about this. I think part of it is the humanizing of someone. Like, you and I, we're riding, right? We're in the car, we're walking the dog, we're at the gym, we're doing whatever. We're together. There's a real person here. It's like a real live thing you're not showing up to. And also, I have set some expectations and I have given you some information. So there is actually a meaningful conversation you're hoping to have with me, instead of sort of assuming that I'm going to get on the call with you and just blast you with sales mojo and goodness, right? And that's not a impossible thing to be worried about when you've got a referral. You know, we've all had people we've been referred to and we get there and we're like, whoa, this is not the energy I was anticipating. However, generally speaking, when you have somebody who you've been listening to on a podcast for a while, You show up and either immediately you understand the energy is off and it is not what you thought it was going to be and it's an immediate red flag. Or you show up and you're like, yes, this is a person I've been hanging out with. And so again, that humanization, I think, really helps. But also, and maybe more importantly, there is a meaningful conversation to have. You have questions, you have thoughts, you have something you're excited to talk to me about. And that makes a huge, huge difference. However, if you're finding that people come through the podcast and they're still not the right fit client. So you've got, I'm not going to say bad leads because I don't want to put any judgment on these people. They're just not a right fit, right? Poor fit leads. And they're showing up and they're not converting. They're showing up and they're not who you work with. They're not looking to work with someone in the way you work. That's a content problem because they are currently using your show to be educated and to be converted because they're getting on the sales call with you or they're buying the program or they're joining the membership. So it's working. What's not working is the information you're giving them in that training, educating, conversion process. You've not set them up to self-identify. And so there's absolutely things we can do, and we're going to talk about that as we move through this episode to make sure that if we are getting leads and they're just not the right fit leads, there's 1% changes we can make to improve that. But if right now you're not getting any leads, you're not seeing any conversations come through, you're not seeing any sales happen via your podcast, then there is other things we need to look at. Those are not the same problem. If you're not getting any leads, but you are seeing show growth, it is likely that you are following or working strategies that don't align with a sales tool growth. They work for a content machine growth. And that's a difference. That's impactful and going to be felt. And it can really fall into two categories, I think, where this happens. Again, the show, like I mentioned, the growth for the sake of growth is absolutely a part of this. The other side of it that I debated talking about, but I think it's worth acknowledging because I know for me, this is the one I fall into the most, if I'm being transparent and honest. Bleh. We start creating content for our colleagues and not our clients. We want to sound cool to the other people who also know what we're talking about. We get a bit jargony. We get a bit too in the weeds of what we're talking about. And it becomes not just inaccessible because it's not that the people who are hearing us don't understand, but uninteresting. And I think that's the more dangerous place to be, right? Is you're just not interesting. You're not retaining listeners. You're not getting people to pay attention. They're not coming back because they understand that it's not for them. And so a good sign that this is something that maybe you have fallen into is you have gotten really into educating and providing value in a really like proving how smart I am way. And what you're going to see is you're going to see DMs from people who do what you do. You're going to see, engagement on the social media platform of your choice, Threads, Instagram, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, whatever it is. I'm assuming it's not Facebook. I'm assuming it's not Twitter, because you're here. But what you're seeing is you're seeing your colleagues. You are seeing the people who aren't going to hire you be the only ones kind of raising their hand and talking back. And that's a really good indication that we might be off track. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time in this space today. This isn't the thing I want us to talk about mostly, but it is something that happens. It is something that I think is important to be aware of. And if it rings true for you, then it really comes down to doing the same things we're going to talk about, as we talk about making these shifts later in the episode. But it might not be that you're, completely off track. It might just be that you're talking to the wrong people. And that might be one of the most obvious ways that is being reflected back to you is that the only thing you're hearing from is from colleagues, from people who also work in your space, in your industry, in your niche, whatever. It's a big one. So, what are some of the signs? Let's talk more about these signs because I think they're really really important. And these are going to be signs that you're attracting listeners and you're not attracting right fit buyers. You're not attracting good quality leads. You're not activating possible buyers. And so the first one we're going to work through 3. The first one is that people who listen love the show, but they don't actually do anything with the show. This actually showed up for a client of ours last year. She's been in production with us for a while, and she was working through an evolution in her business, sort of evolving her ideal clients. And I hesitant to say evolving so much as refining. She had kind of a wide amount of offerings, but she had really started to narrow in the last, well, now it's been 2.5 years, but over the course of the last couple of years, she's really started narrowing down and really targeting in her work where it is most impactful. And so it was not so much about evolving, but again, sort of niching down, sort of getting more and more specific because this was actually showing up. She had a roundtable call and she did this. I think she was doing it quarterly, but I could be wrong about that. But she was doing this call, and what she was finding is the folks were showing up for the call, and she'd see the same people kind of showing up call after call, and they were asking almost verbatim the same questions every time. And they'd get a great insight and they'd be like, "Oh, yes, this is fantastic." And then the next call or a couple calls later, the same person would show up with the same problem because they loved the content. They would get on the call and they would just be running over with how much they loved the show and how impactful it'd been. And I share it with so and so, and it's so great. Thank you for doing it. I just wanted to get some clarity on this. And it was the same thing every time because they loved the show, but they weren't taking action. They weren't actually doing anything with the information they were given because they weren't being either motivated into that or, and again, I try not to pass large sweeping judgments over people, but in some cases, when this is the case, and I know for those that are coaches and consultants and service providers that I talk to, we've all had this happen. So I'm assuming you have felt this in your business too, where it's just like this person is most comfortable in this discomfort. This is somebody who's currently most okay with sitting in their problem, trying to fix it, talking about it, talking it through. And I say this as somebody who has been there. I remember working with a business coach when we first launched the agency in we officially launched it in 2019, but I was moving towards it in late 2018, and I was working with my business coach and we were looking at how we were going to roll this out, and I was like really attached to the fact that I was going to keep the membership I ran that I ran at the time, teaching social media. We had a podcasting course in there. It was a great program. I really loved it. But I was going to keep my personal brand and I was going to keep doing that teaching and I was going to keep doing the membership, and I was going to launch and run this at the time full service digital marketing agency. We were doing social, we were doing email, we were doing podcasting, we were doing it all. And I was like, I'm going to do both of these things. It's going to be fine. And for honest to goodness, like 18 months maybe, I would show up to calls every time with roughly the same problem. I'm tired, I'm burned out, I can't get all this done. I've got all of this stuff that needs to happen. I'm overwhelmed. It was always some version of that. Until one day, the light bulb popped and I was like, this is unsustainable. I cannot keep doing this. And so I think it was either in 2019 or it might have taken all the way until early 2020. So like, lots of crazy things were happening then. And I decided I can't keep doing this. So I closed the membership. I stepped away from the teaching stuff I was doing under my personal brand and I moved all in on the agency. And then almost immediately after that, we streamlined the business so that we were only offering podcast production, the agency. And so I heavily sort of downsized all of the things I was doing and really focused in on the thing that I was the most lit up by. But I couldn't do that until I was ready. I couldn't do that until I was ready to make that move. And when we have a podcast, we have a tool that we're really able to allow somebody to sit in their discomfort for as long as they want to, and they can be supported by what we're talking through, and they can have the insights at the level they're open to having those insights. But until they're ready to move into what's next, we can't like push them off the bridge, right? My coach couldn't climb through my computer screen and slap me, although I'm sure there were lots of times that she would have liked to. And I say that with such confidence because we were still friends and she has told me so. Uh, but there does have to be sort of this next step. And when you're attracting the wrong clients, you're going to find that you're attracting a lot of these people who are just not yet buyer ready. And that generally is a good sign that your content is talking about something too early in the problem, right? We're talking to people who are still in that like discovery of their problem place instead of a looking for a solution place, because they're currently looking at ways to identify their problem. And that seems to be about it because they're not moving forward. And so that's a sign that it's time to make a change with our content, because you're creating stuff that's for them, but it's misaligned. You are educating them, likely too much, without moving them to a decision or helping create any urgency for them, or help them see the urgency they may be already feeling and show them a way out of that urgency. Number two, and again, we're in a second, we'll talk through some shifts to make. I want to first just sort of sit with sort of some of the signs that we've got those wrong fit clients, or wrong fit leads, really. So number two sign, you are getting leads, but they are not ideal clients. So this is a little different in the sense that, like in the first case, we're looking for people who just keep showing up in our DMs, showing up on our workshop calls or our roundtable calls or to webinars or in our inbox. I've absolutely had this version of it. We actually had a production client at the tail end of last year who were the DMs was definitely the problem. And we were like, cool, where do we tighten things up? Where are the places that we use this data point to point us in the right direction? So this version, though, where we're talking about we're getting leads, we're getting on sales calls, but they're not right fit clients, then a lot of times what's wrong is not so much the podcast, because it's working. It's getting people on calls with us. The messaging might be off. The understanding of your niche and where they're at might have some missing pieces. Your positioning might be off. And so this is a really good indicator that honestly your podcast is working, but there's something internally in your business that's off. We had a client we worked with. Oh my gosh, this was a few years ago now. We had a client we worked with in a podcast strategy intensive. So I guess probably 2023. But one of the things that was really interesting is in working through their podcast strategy, we actually identified that there was an offer issue. So there was a issue in their offer. Their offer was not actually set up to attract the kind of clients they wanted to work with. They were attracting done for you clients, but they had built a done with you offer. And so they couldn't get folks to convert. They weren't right fit clients. And that's because when we looked at their content, everything pointed to the fact that, like, hand this off. Let us take care of this. Like, here's the benefits of having help with this. But then when they went to sell them the offer and they actually got on the sales call, their leads were left with like, oh, well, I'm actually looking for somebody who can just make this happen, who can just do this. But the offer was largely consultancy. It was largely like, I'm going to help you and your team through this. And so they actually went and worked with a business coach and refined their offer, and then leveraged the podcast strategy we built in that intensive to start getting clients who were correctly aligned with different level offers. And it was hugely impactful, but it wasn't until we used the podcast, like we really sat down with the podcast strategy, that we were able to see that the issue was actually an offer issue. Not exclusively though. So let's look at another example where it was the podcast. For another client we worked with just last year, we sat down and we realized that they had niched down, but their content hadn't. And so where they were now talking to just this one section of their previous audience, their podcast was still pulling kind of a wide net. And so some of their leads were incredible, were perfect. And we're like, yay, we're nailing it. And then for like every call that would be perfect, we'd get one or two, or she'd come back and she'd be like, I don't know what's happening. Why are these people on the phone with me? I can't, I'm not, we're not, this is not at all the right fit. And it was because we had this huge net of things we were talking about on the podcast because she had had that for a long time. Because again, she was working with people at lots of different levels. But in narrowing, the podcast content had not come along with it. So what did we do? We narrowed the content. We started getting hyper focused on answering the questions that her right fit clients had and only answering those, only speaking to those conversations, and more and more and more frequently until she kind of stopped getting them at all. She was getting, instead of sort of the 2-to-1 bad to good, she was getting the 2-to-1 good to bad. She was getting more and more of those right fits until this point where now most of the folks she gets on the calls are exactly where they need to be. They're exactly, and they're ready to buy when they get there. So you're getting leads, but you're not getting ideal clients. The third piece of this, the third way this shows up is your podcast objectively is not aligned with what you sell. I see this a ton in intensives. And it is largely because of something we talked about early in this episode where they're taking advice of somebody who's really focused on growth and not sales. A lot of times this comes from folks who have been DIYing their strategy and largely relying on their audience to tell them what they want to hear. If you've ever done an Instagram story and said, hey, I'm getting ready to do a podcast batch recording, let me know what you want me to talk about. And you sort of ended up in a deep, deep pool of sharing sort of the behind the scenes structure of your business. ChatGPT is also really, really good at providing you content ideas that are honestly better equipped for a business coach looking to sort of MLM their business model to their clients, which is something we see a ton of. Business coaches teaching business coaches how to be business coaches, for business coaches, for business coaches, for business coaches, and so on until we reach the bottom of that particular pyramid. This is a really easy trap to fall into because it feels like we should be doing more of what the people who like our show already want us to do. However, they're already not buying. Giving them more of it does not necessarily mean they will start buying. And we have to make sure that those are folks who are, again, a right fit for our offers. We start building a show for someone else instead of us. And I know I talk a ton about the fact that your podcast isn't for you, it's for your leads, it's for your potential clients, it's for your future clients. It's also not for the folks in your Instagram DMs. And it is for your business's growth, for your sales. It is for you in the sense that generating sales using this tool is the only way you stay in business long enough to support your clients. And so when we're running around chasing the whims of our maybe audience, we run further and further away from being connected with our larger marketing strategy. We get further and further away from being connected to our offers. The other big, big, big way we see this is folks who are running guest-driven shows and are focused more on audience number than conversation. It's not about getting the big names in your space to come on and give the same interview they've given on 19 other podcasts. I promise you, one uncomfortable solo podcast will get you further. Because more often than not, and we've really got to do an episode coming up on this because I have seen so many people talking about it online lately, but more often than not, it's going to be much more impactful for your prospects and your leads to hear from you. And more often than not, your right fit clients are turning off that guest interview, or maybe worse, just skipping it. They're never hitting play. So it doesn't matter that you tied that conversation in with what you talk about, because they're listening to you because they want to get to know you, because they are deciding if they want to buy from you. And when we start chasing growth by way of big name guests, we get further and further away from covering the topics that actually impact our potential clients, our best fit leads. So, how do we make this shift? How do we start turning the other direction? Number one, instead of trying to talk to everybody, talk to your ideal buyer's problems. The way we talk about this most often is, and we talked a ton about this in the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. What I want you to start with is what problem your offer solves. Next, what are the questions that your best fit leads had before they bought from you? There's your podcast content. Literally, that's the whole thing. That's what I'm selling you. So I want you to shift from doing episodes like how do I market my business to how can high-end coaches use their podcast to convert more mastermind clients. Do you see how, if you were a business coach looking to hire somebody for podcast strategy, the second one was a much easier way for you to identify that I'm talking to you? Instead of XYZ guest talks about XYZ's book, I want you to say, here's how my client got XYZ result by doing ABC. There's a guest interview that'll get turned on because it's a case study. There's a guest interview that grows your audience because it's entirely likely that your client also shares that episode. But it grows your audience with potential clients, with high quality prospects. It's not growth for the sake of growth. Okay. Number two, align your content with your offers. Again, we're working backwards from the offer. And then inside the show, we are planting seeds. We're talking about how this came up. You've heard me do this in this show. We're talking about how this came up in a podcast strategy intensive. This happened with a production partner we were working with last year. These aren't made up. These aren't sort of pulled out of a hat. I'm not asking you to just like pepper on flavoring here. No. Think about the experiences you've had and work them into your content. You have them. They're naturally occurring. This is one of the fantastic ways that we can start adding social proof and client experience without having to have our client come on and tell their story, without having to give details or names. I've given several real life client examples today. You don't know who any of them are. I've absolutely protected their anonymity and our privacy and still shown you what's possible in the work that we do, because I am tying our outcome, our content to our offer, to working with us. I'm not trying to sell you that this podcast is going to solve all your problems. I'm telling you how in your next step, we can see the result you want to see. And because I love a good segue, that brings us to our final shift, and that's your calls to action. And I'm going to include an episode in the show notes we did on calls to action at some point. I can't remember when it came out, but we did an episode on calls to action and building your calls to action because this is often the easiest thing to improve. If they don't know what to do next, if you've not made it clear what to do next, they're not going to do anything. You have to tell them how to drink the water, not just lead them to the lake. And so I want you to be directing them toward the action you want them to take. Yes, in a structured way at the end of the episode, which is something I'm going to do in just a minute, but also throughout the episode. Tell them what happens. Talk about how this happened. One of the things we've done today is we've planted seeds. We've talked about things like podcast strategy intensives. We've talked about things like production. Where I could have made that better is if I'd said, in production, when we sit down on our quarterly calls, these are the things we're looking at, and here's what came up. I could have dug deeper in those places. Now, I wanted to have a larger conversation, so I didn't have the time to dig in those ways. But if you listen to this episode, you'll hear that there's probably lots of episodes in here, meaning there's places I could go down, there's verticals I could follow, and roads I could travel with you, where I could dig deeper into that, where I could start setting expectations about what happens in that next step. If your clients don't know what happens after they buy from you, they're going to struggle to buy from you, especially those of us who are working in higher dollar investments and higher touch services. If you're somebody running a 5-figure mastermind program that's a 12-month commitment and includes 2 retreats, it's going to take someone understanding what's going to happen on those retreats. And some of this is not our fault. Some of this is because we need to buy back trust that somebody else lost, especially those of us who are working with established business owners who have very likely already been burned. But telling them not just where to go next, but what happens when they go there might be that missing piece for you. So if you're sitting there and you're saying, Stacy, I already listened to the calls to action episode. I know my calls to action are great. I am nailing them, baby. Then good job. I'm so excited. What it might be is that lack of clarity around what happens after they follow that call to action. So things like audio sales pages, things like talking about the offer inside of your episode when you're planting seeds, digging into what part of the episode really had that, what part of the offer really had that impact. That could be your next step. If you want help on identifying this next step, that's where I come in. That's where you and I sit down. Because if your podcast is growing, but it's not attracting the right clients, or if you're seeing sales and conversion via like your social media content, but not your podcast content, that's where your disconnect is. It's your strategy. It's your plan. It's the actual content. If you know you need a reset, now's a really good time to book a podcast strategy intensive so that we can do that. We can sit down, we can get in. I'm going to assess your podcast. I do an audit before we even sit down together. We sit down, we're going to review that audit, and then we're going to talk through some of those decisions that you might need to make, those 1% shifts that can happen. And then we're going to build you an entire quarter of a content plan. So 12 weeks, you walk away ready to go. And by the way, I send that over the very same day. So in one day, you are going to get a conversation with me, your feedback and audits, next steps, and also your 12-week content plan ready to roll so that you can take that momentum right into getting that content produced so that you can start making those 1% changes and seeing that big impact. Head on over to grab yours at uncommonlymore.com/intensive. Heads up, there's 2 options there. You can if you're ready to roll, just book your call. If you have questions about whether a production contract might be a better fit or an intensive might be a better fit, I'm happy to have a chat. On that very same page, you will see a link to book a call with me. So either way, head on over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive and take that next step. Either book a chat with me and we can talk through the right next fit for you, or go ahead and book your intensive, get on my calendar, and the next time we chat, it will be on your podcast strategy intensive, and I will have a full audit for your show ready to roll. I can't wait. I'm excited. I will see you right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.